session of today of Brain Awareness Week organized by Dana Foundation alongside organizations like International Brain Research Organization and Federation of European Neuroscience Societies. So this is the fourth day of the week that we are holding this session, and welcome back everyone. I'm Anjali Salot, member of organizing team for this event. I'm a master's student in neuropsychology from Gujarat Forensic Sciences University and a part of Brain Awareness Week organizing team. With us today we have Dr. Pratik Mutha, who has been faculty at IIT Gandhinagar since 2013. He's in the Department of Biological Engineering and Center for Cognitive and Behavioral Sciences in IIT Gandhinagar. He received his PhD from Penn State Universities and then had a 4-year doctoral stint at the New Mexico Veterans Affairs healthcare system before returning to India to join IIT Gandhinagar. Mr. Mutha's research interests broadly lie in understanding the neural control of human movement and the disruption of this control in patients with neurological damage. This research his research informs the development of novel rehabilitation strategies for improving movement deficits in such patients. Today's session by Dr. Pratik Mutha covers the topic of every move you make, the neuroscience of pointing and reaching. Sir, you can start.
Thank you, Anjali. Thank you for this opportunity. Um, I'm gonna go full screen now and just let me know if you see it. Uh,
Yes, sir.
okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Um, we will talk about briefly the neural control of movement. This is something that I study in my lab at the Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar, and you can find me on Twitter at the address that I mentioned. This is a platform that I recently joined, and I am enjoying it thoroughly. I look forward to connecting with more people there. Uh, so this is our lab logo. We are called the Control and Learning of Action Lab, abbreviated as COLA. And we primarily are interested in the mechanisms and the neural substrates that underlie the learning of skilled movements. So for today, I want to start with this quote by Sir Charles Sherrington. Sherrington was a neurophysiologist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine in 1932. And here's what he said about the movement system. He says that to move things is all that mankind can do, and for this task, the sole executant is a muscle, whether it be whispering a syllable or felling of a forest. Sorry, that should be an or instead of an off. Whether it is whispering a syllable or felling of a forest. What Sherrington was essentially implying was that movement really is the only way of interacting with the world around us and causing a change in it, causing some impact on the world around it. Uh, Now, it turns out that sweating also is one way to change or have an impact on the environment. But really, other than sweating, movement is the only way to do it. Um, and some have argued basically that that is why we even have a brain, so that we can move and interact with the environment around us. So just as an example, you can take communication. uh, Writing, of course, involves movement. There is no need for explaining that. Speech, no matter how little, also involves contraction of muscles. uh, Gestures obviously involves the motor system, and so does sign language. Uh, in fact, you can go a step further and talk about the four F's. The four things that are important for our survival as a species. And the bottom line is that they all involve some kind of motor output in response to an external or an internally generated stimulus. So fighting, clearly, you need to contract muscles if you have to fight a predator. If you have to flee from a predator, obviously, again, you have to move and move fast. Feeding, again, involves the motor system, and uh, reproduction, the fourth F, right? They all involve movement, and they all involve some kind of motor response to either an external stimulus, for instance, in the case of fighting and fleeing, some predator that you're trying to flee from, or some internal stimulus, in the case of feeding, for instance, hunger, right? Okay, so in very simple terms, you could think of the brain as some kind of response generating machine, where it's taking in some stimulus, either internal or external, doing some processing based on that stimulus and generating a motor response. The problem is that we generally consider this process of sensory, stimulus to motor, sort of, stimulus response mapping, to be very simple and effortless, in the sense that we generally don't have to think about movement. We think it's easy, we think it's not complicated, we can move in many ways without really being consciously sort of engaged in the act of moving itself, right? So we generally have that perception of movement. And in some cases, it can be very, very simple, right? So here is an example of a very simple stimulus response association. So here is a lady walking on the beach. There's a broken glass bottle. Some of you may have experienced this while walking on the beach or somewhere else. And there's a piece of glass um, that sort of, this lady steps onto. The response here is to lift uh, the leg off from the piece of glass. But while lifting the leg up, you also don't want to fall, and therefore you contract the extensor muscles on the other side. So this is called a flexor withdrawal crossed extensor reflex. Basically, the leg that steps on the glass, the flexor muscles get activated to withdraw it from that painful stimulus, and to prevent falling, the opposite extensor muscles on the other leg get activated so that you can still be upright. Now, this is a fairly simple response. In fact, there is no brain involved, right? This response is completely spinal. The circuitry has been worked out, and it's a nice stereotypical response that you get in response, when you have such a stimulus that's painful. But the not all our movements are reactive like this. They are not all reflexes. In fact, most of the movements that we make are what are called volitional. They're purposeful, and they're often uh, made to achieve some kind of goal. uh, and the control of such movements, right, these voluntary movements, is actually incredibly complex. And again, we make this fallacy of not appreciating this complexity. We again think that even voluntary movements are simple and effortless. If I'm thirsty, I just have to stretch out my hand, grab a cup of water, and I uh, am able to make that movement fairly easily. But for the motor system, this task is incredibly hard. And we don't really appreciate how hard it is until we say, okay, let's try and build a robot or a machine that moves as well as we do. Right? And you all know that we have miserably failed at this. Uh, Although we are getting better, I will admit that. But if we've built very, very smart machines that can beat us in chess. But really, we have not been able to build a robot or a machine that moves as well as even a 5-year-old child can. Okay. uh, the other time, sort of, we realize how hard the control of movement is when we watch patients who have had some kind of neurological disorder and have lost a part of their brain, so that such that it produces movement deficits. And again, when we try to rehabilitate such people, it is very, very, very difficult. uh, and that's when we appreciate, or at least to some extent, the complexity underlying the control of movements, and the ability to regain that control after rehabilitation following a neurological injury. And finally, when we play sports, when we look at somebody like Roger Federer or Sachin Tendulkar or LeBron James, uh, we realize how hard it is, and when we try and emulate them, we realize how hard it is to get to their level of skill, right? How hard it is to make the kinds of movements that we do, and how complex the underlying sort of mechanisms might be. Uh, so my goal really is to emphasize to you, this complexity, and sort of bring out this complexity for you all. Uh, so let's consider this situation. Why is this sensory to motor transformation so complex? And we will address this question with a simple example. So you are out at a picnic in a garden. There is a cup of water or soda or whatever your favorite drink is sitting on a table, and you want to reach out and grab it, right? So this orange circle in this figure is the cup, uh, and you are standing close to it, and your arm, let's say, is in a position that is shown, right? So the first step that needs to be taken care of when you want to pick up this piece of cup, uh, this cup, is to try and estimate where it is in space, right? So you want to identify the location of the cup in space. You also want to identify the location of the hand in space, right? Now this is a very, very complex process. We don't fully understand it, because both the location of the cup can be uh, sort of seen visually, but the location of the hand can also be seen visually, but also be sensed through proprioception. Now, how we combine these two sources of information, of vision and proprioception, and then also other sensory systems like touch. Imagine you're standing, you have information coming from the base of your foot via the touch system. You know your orientation relative to gravity, via the vestibular system. How all of this information is put together to estimate the location of your body and the location of external objects in space is really unknown to us, right? But we know we do that, right? But that's the first step if we want to achieve this goal of picking up this cup. The second step then is to plan a trajectory that will take our hand to the cup. That's what is shown in this figure B here. So you've identified where the cup is, you've identified where your hand is. Now you've got to identify the trajectory that you will take to bring your hand to the cup, right? Uh, the third step is to go from that hand trajectory plan. Let's say you want to move in a straight line, or you want to move in a curved path. You want to move in a curved path because there is something in the way. There's an obstacle. You figure all that out. But then what you have to do is convert that plan of how you're going to move the hand to how you're going to actually rotate your joints, because you have to rotate your joints in order to make this end point or the hand move. And that process is what is called inverse kinematics, right? You've got to go from a hand trajectory to joint rotations. And then the final step really is to determine the torques or the dynamics that are going to be needed in order to rotate your joints. And there can be more complexity involved in this, where you say, okay, if I have to generate these torques, these are the muscles that I have to activate. And if I have to activate these muscles, these are the neurons that I must send signals down. So you see that, even the task of picking up this simple this cup is involved, is very, very complex, very involved, and consists of a number of steps that the motor system must figure out. uh, And in doing so, let the motor system actually has to face a lot of challenges, or has to overcome a lot of challenges. So for instance, uh, there's a lot of redundancy in our motor system. We have more than 360 joints, there's more than 650 muscles, and the biomechanics is often complex and nonlinear. So what that means is that the force that a muscle generates is a function of its length, and that relationship is not linear. If I have my arm fully extended, the force that I'm going to generate is not going to be very high. If I have my hand elbow joint fully flexed, I can't generate a lot of force either. And it's somewhere in the middle of that joint uh, that I can generate a lot of force. So these relationships between the length of a muscle and its force generation is highly nonlinear. Uh, there's also redundancy in the fact that I could have the same endpoint position, right? I could have my hand. I don't know if you can see my hand, but I could have my hand in the same location, but then have many different joint orientations for the same location of that hand. I could also move in many different ways. In the example of picking up that cup, I could choose to go fast, I could choose to go slow, I could choose to go straight, I could choose to make curved paths. Uh, all that is possible. So there's really infinite possible ways in which this, any volitional action can be achieved. And that is a function of this redundancy that exists in our motor system. And the motor system somehow has to overcome this redundancy. uh, there's also delays, right? So some of you may have experienced this. Again, if you touch something hot, like a pan that's kept on a stove at home, you don't know that the stove is on, and you go and touch the pan. You don't feel the burning sensation immediately, right? And the reason is that there are these delays between when the stimulus occurs and when you perceive it, right? And that's a consequence of these slower uh, sort of transmission of signals uh, from the periphery to the brain. Uh, and these delays can be actually quite difficult to overcome. And there can be delays even on the output side, right? If I send a signal now to reach the periphery, we think it's instantaneous, but there's a certain delay associated with sending a command to a muscle and the muscle actually generating a force. Uh, and again, these delays must be overcome somehow. These delays can actually cause a lot of instability in the system, and can lead to erroneous movements. Just as an example, if my sensory information is delayed by 100 milliseconds, let's say I've touched something, and by the time the brain gets that information, it's been 100 milliseconds. uh, by the time I act on the information that I've got and send out the commands, there's, let's say, another 100 millisecond delay. So the command that I will generate is based on information that is old by 100 milliseconds. It's not the most current information, right? And if you have long delays, it can lead to instability in the system. A good example is you trying to manipulate the shower in your house. You change the shower knob, it takes a while for the hot water to come, uh, and so you turn it even more, and then by the time the hot water comes, it is just too hot, and then you have to go back and correct it again, right? So these are the kinds of delays that I'm talking about. Long delays can lead to instabilities in the system, and the motor system must deal with that. Uh, the third is noise. This is very poorly defined, but these are random fluctuations that can occur in signals. These are biological signals. They can be corrupted by these random fluctuations that occur. There's also unpredictability in the environment. Let's go back to the example of you trying to pick up the cup. Uh, I mentioned that you're at a picnic in an outdoor space, and then there could be, you've started your movement, and there could be a strong gust of wind that perturbs you, or it blows the cup away. right? So you can never plan for these unpredictable situations, even as you're trying to go from the sensory stimulus to the motor response. uh, and finally, your motor system itself changes over time. uh, People age, people's bodies change, you grow muscles, you work out in the gym, uh, and or people end up with some disease that creates problems in the motor system. So all these are challenges that the motor system must face when it is actually trying to generate a motor response, right? Uh, and there are ways to overcome some of these challenges. For instance, redundancy may be overcome by some kind of optimization. Those of you who have a computer science kind of a background might understand this. If you have infinite possible solutions to a problem, uh, the way to come up with one solution in when many different possibilities exist is to optimize. uh, what the nervous system tries to optimize when it is generating a particular action is a point of a huge debate. I don't think there is one answer. I think uh, that what the system optimizes is determined by what task the person is trying to do. For instance, while walking, there is a thought that we might be conserving energy, but while jumping as high as possible, clearly we are not trying to minimize energy. uh, so some of what the nervous system is trying to optimize might actually um, be dependent on the task, but it's a way to overcome redundancy. uh, the delays may be overcome by generating predictions. For instance, you could say, okay, I am going to make this movement. What is the sensory feedback that I can expect to get if I made a movement in this environment, right? And so you could build models of your own body and the environment that help you make these predictions and overcome these delays. Um, so you don't have to wait for sensory information to come in. You could simply make decisions based on your predictions about the sensory information that might come in. Um, Unpredictability in the environment is a little difficult to pre-plan for. I mentioned that earlier, but you can deal with unpredictability through things like co-contraction and smart reflexes. And smart reflexes is something that I'll come to later. But this again is something that you've experienced before. You're standing in a bus, and the bus suddenly accelerates. You co-contract and you stiffen up, basically, right? Uh, to prevent yourself from falling. The problem with co-contraction, of course, is that it is metabolically very, very expensive. You can't keep all your muscles active all the time. You'd get fatigued. But it is a way to deal with unpredictability in the environment. Uh, Variability and the changes in body and environment over time can be overcome with learning. And no matter how well you learn, you still cannot, perfectly predict what is going to happen in the environment. So learning only gets you so far, right? And you've got to have some reactive systems to help you overcome the unpredictability. But the nervous system has evolved to overcome some of these challenges. uh, but the point that I want to make to you really strongly is that if all this complexity has to be dealt with, if all these challenges have to be overcome, uh, it is not so surprising then that a big chunk of the brain is dedicated to the neural control of movement. So, what I have on this slide, on the left is a monkey brain, and on the right is the human brain. Uh, and the shaded areas are all dedicated to the neural control of movement. On the human brain, except this part here, which is shown in pink, which is largely sensory in nature. The visual sort of cortex is back here, the auditory cortex is here, and these areas down here are dedicated to things like object identification and on object recognition and things like that. The rest of the brain really is, a big chunk of it is dedicated to the control of movement, both in humans and in monkeys. Um, and of course, cortex is the highest level in this hierarchy of motor control. uh, a lot of cortex is dedicated to control of movement, but this cortex is continuously interacting with and influencing systems that are lower in the hierarchy. uh, uh, what is shown here is some loops that the cortex makes with the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. These are subcortical structures. The cortex has a way to influence the brainstem. The brainstem projects to proximal regions of the spinal cord, and this enables control of posture and things like that. Uh, and then the cortex can also directly influence the spinal cord itself and the neurons that then project to muscles in the limbs. So there's a lot of back and forth between these areas uh, of cortex, subcortical regions, brainstem, and spinal cord. Um, if you look at the cortex, if you look at at least the primary motor areas, they contain maps of the body, right? So in other words, these are somatotopically organized. Somato means body, and topic means a map. So so motor cortical regions seem to contain these body maps. uh, and the organization of these maps is quite interesting. uh, it looks something like what is shown on this screen. Uh, the highest area, the largest area of cortex is dedicated to body parts with which we can make very fine movements, right? So fingers, for example, a large chunk of the motor cortex is dedicated to the hand, and actually even you can find individual finger representations in there. uh, a large chunk is dedicated to mouth and facial muscles for speech production, right? Speech is a very, very fine uh, motor response that you're making. And so a huge chunk of the brain has to be dedicated to it. But if you look at things like the back, even though the body part itself is quite big, not a lot of brain is dedicated to controlling movements of the back. uh, and as a consequence, you can't make very fine movements with your back. uh, the finest movements that you can make are of course with your fingers. uh, what is interesting is that these maps are not static. Okay, so these maps can change depending on how you use your effectors. And here is an example of that. Here is a mouse brain. One is the map for three different regions in a normal mouse. Okay, so this is a normal somatotopic arrangement. And the green region is dedicated to movement of the forelimb. The orange region is dedicated to movement of the whiskers, and the blue region is dedicated to movements of muscles that are surrounding the eyes, right? And what is shown in this plot below is what happens when you cut the facial nerve. This facial nerve projects to muscles that move the whiskers. So when you cut it, you can't move the whiskers anymore. And as a consequence, you see that the area of the brain or the cortex that was dedicated to the whiskers is gone, and these other regions have taken over. uh, right? So you basically use it or lose it. That's the phenomenon here. If a body part is not being used, uh, regions that control other body parts that are being used more extensively will take over. So there's a lot of plasticity in the cortical system, and what rehabilitation scientists try to do is exploit this plasticity to enable recovery from neurological injury in patients. Uh, what is also interesting, and this is some of the work that we've recently done in our lab, is if you block cortical plasticity, you can actually disrupt the ability of people to learn. So this is an experiment that we've done. It's a learning study. Uh, where people make a bunch of baseline movements first, then they learn, they're exposed to a certain perturbation, and they're required to account for the effects of that perturbation, and then they're tested for after effects of that learning. But in one group of people, we block the plasticity uh, that comes with learning beforehand by using this technique called high definition transcranial direct current stimulation. Okay, so it's electrical stimulation of the brain, and in the configuration that we are using blocks this plasticity. So the kind of effect that you get in normal healthy people who don't get this kind of stimulation, in our case we do sham stimulation, looks something like this. So if you look at, the first movement that people make when they're exposed to that perturbation, this perturbation actually throws off their movements. Usually if I asked any of you under normal circumstances to make a movement from this point here to this target here, you would go in a straight line like is shown in this dotted trajectory, right? But then we introduce a manipulation which throws off that movement, and people make these curved movements. And over time, people actually start to learn, they account for the effects of that perturbation, and start making straighter movements even when that perturbation is there. And you can quantify this as a reduction in these, what we call direction errors, basically the difference between the straight line movement from the start position to this target and the angle of that trajectory, or the line of that trajectory. So initially here we're using a 30-degree perturbation, like is shown in this figure up here. uh, and so the initial error is 30, but then it reduces with practice. When you remove the perturbation, people make errors in the opposite direction. So all this is very well studied. There's thousands of studies that have done this. What we did was we blocked the plasticity in parietal cortex, in posterior parietal cortex. It has been shown to play a role in movement control. It's not a primary motor region, but yet it contributes heavily to the neural control of movement. And we use, what is called cathodal high definition transcranial direct current stimulation. The current amplitude is 2 milliamperes, and we leave it on for 15 minutes. Uh, and then those of you who are familiar with the 10-20 EEG system, we apply this over the P3 region of the left hemisphere and the P4 region of the right hemisphere, which is close to the intraparietal sulcus. And what happens when you do that is that you can actually disrupt this learning to some extent. It's not perfect, okay? It's not that there is no learning. There's a little bit of learning, but these people who get this kind of stimulation, you could imagine this as a transient neural injury, okay? It's safe, it's not invasive at all, but it has a similar effect. Okay, it's not really an injury, but you could assume that is the effect that it causes. And you could see the effect in the trajectory as well. The first trial, when people are exposed to this perturbation, is curved like the people who don't get the stimulation. But then the last trial is also curved. It doesn't become straight like the black dotted line does. And if you plot the errors, they don't get down to the level that these sham subjects show. And the after effects are also smaller. So blocking this plasticity can actually disrupt learning. So but the it's incorrect to think of the brain as simply this response generating machine. It is not that, right? It is not simply taking some kind of stimulus and converting that into a motor response. And our actions are not simply chains of reflexes, right? So we know that our actions are flexible. We know that they are goal directed, and they have what is called, what Shadlin and Gold have called freedom from immediacy, right? Which means they they contain a strong deliberative or a cognitive component that really contextualizes the motor response. And I'll give you an example of this. But from what your everyday experience may have been also, is that you don't make these stereotypical responses under very, very different conditions, right? So you contextualize the motor output uh, to the situation that you are in. And this is perhaps where this green chunk of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, comes in, right? So this is what provides perhaps the ability uh, to to use this cognitive control on top of our motor response. So, this prefrontal cortex enables perhaps this deliberative or cognitive component. It facilitates things like decision making, and then also perhaps guides the correct motor response that is suited to the context that you're making it in. And here's the example, and I mentioned smart reflex before. And here's an example of a smart reflex where the reflex response itself is contextualized depending on the situation that the subject in. This is a classic study uh, that was done by Marsden and colleagues. I should have mentioned it here. Uh, but the task is the following. This person is sitting crouched here. Uh, in the left hand, the person is holding a handle, and this handle can pull the subject forward. And then there are two different contexts, right? So in the one case, the person's holding on to a table with the right hand, and in the second case, uh, the person's holding on to a cup with the right hand. And what is measured is the response in some muscle of the right hand when this left hand is going to be pulled. Okay. And on the bottom is a cartoon version of the actual response that was measured. uh, and so the perturbation is applied on the left hand at time 0. uh, but then you see that this response that you get when there's a table support versus when the person's holding a cup is completely different, right? So you get this nice reflex response at very short latency, 50 milliseconds or so after the perturbations applied, that provides stability. Okay. But then this response is reversed when you're holding the cup, so that you don't spill the liquid that may be in the cup. And so what has happened is that this flexibility is coming from the cognitive system that is riding on top of this stereotypical reflex response that you would have otherwise got, uh, and guiding the motor decision that is suited to the context of either holding the table or holding a cup. uh, and a lot of people have argued that skill acquisition, right, becoming skilled at a certain task, may actually reflect this transition from being in a more deliberative or cognitive decision making state, uh, to uh, moving to making highly automatic motor responses. Uh, so if you take LeBron James, for example, you if what LeBron James is able to do was devoid of any cognitive influence, you would say that his success is because of his motor system. The fact that he is large, he is tall, he is well built, he is strong, and he has potentially very fast reflexes, right? And a lot of people make that argument, uh, that LeBron is LeBron because he has an incredible motor system. But really, that idea is bogus. Uh, and LeBron would not be LeBron if it was not for his cognitive capabilities and his ability to flexibly tailor his motor responses to the context, to the game that he's playing. Uh, and so some people, in making this argument that he's LeBron because he has fast reflexes, uh, you know people forget that basketball is a voluntary action, right? It's a voluntary act, and therefore, uh, you know it is influenced by as much cognition as any voluntary act, if not more than that, right? And so some people, who favor this view have actually gone on to say, to say Einstein is a more evolved genius than LeBron James is some sort of nonsense. The point being that motor control involves as much cognition as trying to be good at chess or trying to solve a really complex physics problem or a maths problem, or some other uh, skills that are considered more cognitive in nature. Okay, so just quickly, the motor system is not a giant reflex machine. It is heavily influenced by cognition, and this cognitive motor divide, the difference between knowing what. So I know what to do to be able to play chess, and knowing how. I know how to play basketball. This divide is some kind of false, cultural obsession. Okay, so I hope you understand this complexity that's involved in the motor system, and I hope you also get the idea that the motor system is as much cognitive as it is just stereotypical stimulus response associations. The last fascinating uh, tidbit that I'll talk uh, about the motor system is that it seems to be neurally lateralized. This doesn't get spoken about much, but I think this is important to recognize, uh, that these cognitive influences that act on uh, the motor system seem to be lateralized to different hemispheres of the brain. And a very good example of this is a condition called idiomotor apraxia. There's many different types of apraxia, uh, but this predominantly occurs after left hemisphere damage and not right hemisphere damage. So right hemisphere damage does not lead to conditions such as apraxia. Now, apraxia, the most common deficit is the spatiotemporal problems that people have in their movements. And here are examples. So this is taken from the work done by Kathy Holland and colleagues, which was published in 2000. Here, what is shown is the subject is told, okay, show me how you would salute. Okay, and this is the kind of movement that they would make. Obviously, the posture of the hand is inappropriate for saluting. You could ask apraxic people to imitate you. So you would salute, and you tell them, okay, now you salute, or you look at, uh, me, look at what I'm doing and try to imitate it. And they would still do the same thing. So it's not a comprehension problem. It's not a problem that occurs only when you ask them to do something and they don't understand it. You could do the action, ask them to imitate it, and they would still have problems. uh, Here is another example where the person is asked to brush their to show the experimenter how they would brush their teeth. If you and I were to do it, we would go something like this, where the brush is what goes on the teeth. In this case, the patient ends up using the finger as the brush, and these are exaggerated. Okay, these are shown just for demonstration. This is not an actual patient. uh, but patients make all kinds of weird postures when they're asked to imitate certain gestures or asked to reproduce certain gestures from memory. Here is another example. What is shown on top is a normal person doing a coin flip kind of an action. So you would flip a coin and you would catch it. And on the bottom is the gestures that an apraxic patient makes. Okay, so these are very weird problems. Uh, so their posture is inappropriate, and their catching gesture is also inappropriate. So their posture for flipping the coin is, I mean, obviously you can't flip a coin if your hand is horizontal like that. The point though is that these kinds of deficits occur mostly after left but not right hemisphere damage. And the other interesting bit here is that these problems are seen even when the left hand is used to make the movements. So we typically think of the left side of the brain controlling the right side of the body, and vice versa. We know that these neural projections are largely crossed from the cortex to the spinal cord, and yet there seems to be this lateralization to this effect where one the left hemisphere damage is producing this weird effect. And the effect seems to occur not just on the right side of the body, but also on the left side. And so this is more like a cognitive problem than a motor problem. Okay. This is again some work that we have done where left but not right hemisphere damage, and in this case, again, specifically parietal cortex damage, seems to disrupt learning. So what is shown in black are baseline movements of a healthy individual. So the person's asked to make a movement from the green starting point to 8 different targets. And most people who are healthy make these straight line movements. Those movements are perturbed in the middle plot using some kind of perturbation. Uh, People make these curved movements as a consequence, but over time, on the third plot, what you see is they start making these straight line movements. Again, even though the perturbation is present, people adapt to the perturbation and they start anticipating the effects of it, and they start compensating beforehand. Um, Here's what somebody with right parietal damage does. Movements are still fairly straight. They're not perfect, but they're okay. Here again, people show these curved movements, but again, these people with right parietal damage often end up making straight movements, typically as straight as healthy individuals would. So there's not really a learning deficit here. Okay, but let's look at what the left parietal damage patients do. Uh, Again, somewhat straight movements. You see some, it's not perfect. Okay, there's some curvature here. Uh, those movements get thrown off uh, when the perturbation is given, but then it is never fixed. Okay, so even at the end of this learning block of trials, these people continue to make these very, very curved movements after left parietal damage, but not right parietal damage. I should mention that the arm that was tested here was the right arm, but we've also done this with the left arm. Uh, and you get very similar effects. Okay, so this is like that TDCS data that I had shown you earlier. In this case, though, it is an actual patient who has had a stroke that was restricted to just the left parietal cortex, and you can see similar kinds of deficits where people simply don't learn. Uh, Here is another example, but this time it's the opposite. Okay, where if you facilitate uh, left hemisphere processing, if you enhance plasticity, you can actually enhance learning more than what you can do if the right hemisphere is stimulated. Okay, so this is also a TDCS study, but in this case, instead of a cathodal TDCS montage that like we have used, these researchers used an anodal arrangement that is known to facilitate plasticity. And the task is somewhat complex. So you squeeze on this contraption here. uh, the harder you squeeze, the harder this cursor moves on the screen, and you have to finish a task of going from this target 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to end on target 5. So you're making these sequential squeezing movements on this little device here. uh, and you're seeing it on screen. You see this cursor moving on the screen, and this is done for many days, and they do this anodal stimulation while people are learning. And what you see is this on the right is a very interesting result. uh, the black portion of this curve is baseline performance. So these groups, one gets sham TDCS, which means no TDCS. The other gets left hemisphere primary motor cortex TDCS, and the third group gets right motor cortex TDCS. Okay, and the black bars, if you compare them, they're not very different, which says that the baseline performance is not different between the groups. But then as they learn, the change in skill, which is what is plotted on the y-axis here, and they have a way to calculate what skill is, but let's assume that we know what skill is. uh, the change in skill is much larger for people who get left hemisphere stimulation versus those who get sham or right hemisphere stimulation. Okay, so there's this weird effect where the left hemisphere seems to have a capacity for um, motor control that is different from the right, and it seems to be sort of biased towards learning. It seems to be biased towards acquisition and storage of information under new conditions. Okay, so if the left hemisphere is doing all this, what is the right hemisphere doing? How is it contributing to motor control? And again, remember that these are really cognitive influences that we're talking about. If you just looked at strength, for instance, and people have done it, and lower level motor responses, you wouldn't find differences between the left and right system. So if you actually measured how hard, for instance, one can squeeze on a dynamometer, uh, the strength is not very different between the left and right arms. But what is different is what the cognitive system puts on top of this motor system. So here's what the right hemisphere contribution seems to be. Uh, and these plots are, again, very similar to the ones that I've shown before. Let's look at the left frontal damage first, the one on the bottom. The leftmost plot here is again baseline movements. Again, no perturbation, just point to point straight, no problems whatsoever. People are exposed to a perturbation that throws off their movements. They make these curved movements, which you see in the second plot. uh, People learn. People are able to learn with this left frontal damage. Now, this is not parietal damage. Okay, parietal damage, people were unable to learn. But here, people start getting better. They make relatively straight movements. And then they also show these after effects when that perturbation is removed. So these errors in the opposite direction compared to when they're first exposed to the perturbation, right? But what is interesting, so there's no real problem here with these left frontal damage patients. But what is really interesting is what this right frontal damage does. So baseline movements, again, no problem. But as soon as you introduce the perturbation, you see that the corrections are gone, right? So these people are unable to deal with this new situation of going from no perturbation to perturbation, and their ability to correct their movements online by inhibiting what their predominant action is. The predominant action is to make this straight line movement, right? Which is what they also do here. But then when this, what they're actually supposed to do is make this correction and go to this target, but they fail to do that. Interestingly, they learn, which is over time, they start making movements straight to the target. But then when you remove the perturbation, they fail to make the correct response either, right? I mean, also, so you can compare these two plots here, what the left frontal damage people are doing and what the right frontal damage people are doing. So here, while the left patients are able to make these online corrections to get to the target, the right frontal damage patients are simply not able to do it. Okay, so dealing with these switches in task conditions seems to be very difficult after right frontal damage in particular, right? So so there's this cognitive system that's dedicated to uh, dealing with these switches, right? Which is, how do I inhibit what I'm doing? How do I plan a new movement and execute it? That seems to fail with this right frontal damage. Okay, so again, the movements themselves seem okay. I mean, they're able to make straight line movements. This is not really a problem with the motor system. Okay, all right. Here's another example of dealing with these switches. So the task here is to make a straight line movement to this target that's shown in a light color here, light blue, but then which can jump occasionally to a different location. And again, people are expected to make this kind of a correction in their trajectory. And when you look at their velocity profile, so the thin line is if you're just making a straight line movement to a target that's not jumping. But then if you have to make a correction, you obviously show this double peaked velocity which corresponds to this outward movement first and then this corrective movement second. And here's what a right frontal damage patient does. Now, these patients are essentially making two different movements, right? So there's this big delay between their initial movement. So their initial movement, they make, their velocity drops to zero, they wait for some time, and then make that second movement to the target, to the jumped target location, to the new target location. And so these delays are essentially a problematic thing, and they have emerged because of this right frontal damage system. And you can compare that to the healthy person here that's in black, where they're able to quickly, even before that that initial movement is completed, make a second corrective movement. But these patients who are shown in blue here are simply unable to do that. They have to make one movement, wait, and then make a second movement. And then in an extreme case, you have a patient who simply is unable to make the corrections at all. So if you look at this, leftmost plot here, these are all hand trajectories. The initial target was here, okay, where the trajectory is ending, and the new jumped target is where it is shown. And this particular patient simply makes that one, predominant movement and is unable to make that corrective movement at all. And these are just, four different conditions like that. So the target jumps from straight ahead to here. In this case, the target jumps from straight ahead to the left, and here it jumps from this right position to straight ahead. And in all cases, you see that the patient's barely able to make any corrective response whatsoever. So so you see that these systems, these cognitive motor systems, seem to have some kind of lateralization, and lateralization tends to be just totally glossed over when we talk about the human motor system. So I thought it would be a nice thing to talk about here. Why this lateralization emerged is an open question, but it may have emerged to increase computational efficiency without really expanding neural tissue too much. So your movements are very complex. To accommodate this complexity, you need more neural tissue. You can't keep expanding neural tissue forever, and because you have huge brains on top of very flimsy necks. uh, and so one way to deal with that problem is may have been uh, to separate function between the hemispheres. So now you don't need as much neural tissue because one side of the brain can be dedicated to one function, and the other side of the brain can be dedicated to some other motor function. Okay, so that's the idea here. So I will quickly summarize what I've told you. We are right on time, I think. So this is my last slide. So I hope I've been able to impress upon you that the neural control of movement is very complex, and it is as much cognitive as it is motor. Uh, this cognitive motor combination can exist at all levels of the neural hierarchy. We talked about the lowest level, which are these smart reflexes, and all the way up to cortex. And this kind of combination is what perhaps gives rise to behaviors that are very flexible and very contextualized. And these cognitive influences on motor control appear to be hemispherically segregated. So I will end there. Again, thank you very much for listening. Thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. Uh, I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, sir. This session was very insightful, and the even the listeners enjoyed so much. So should I start the questions?
Uh, yes, I'm going to escape my
Okay.
uh, full screen. just so that I can see. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So the first question is how much of a voluntary act like sports or driving that involves a lot of cognition goes on to become muscle memory or reflex?
Uh, so this is, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know how much, but certainly skills like sports, dance, driving, these do tend to become very, very automatic and very reflex like. Uh, it just depends on, so sports, for instance, it is not that um, that it's simply okay, practice, and then what you have is, I've gone from a more deliberative state to a more automatic state, and that is simply a consequence of practice. It is not that. There's a lot of other factors that I didn't talk about, for instance motivation, coaching. I don't know what role those play, but a lot of these stereotypical or more automatic responses that we tend to think about, like driving, like sports, like dancing, like playing a musical instrument at a high level, go from a deliberative state to an automatic state. If you look at instructions for juggling, for instance, right, the juggling instructions or how to learn juggling, they are more cognitive in nature, right? It will say, okay, throw the ball in your right hand up. When it is at its highest point, transfer the ball from the left hand to the right hand, and then throw that. These are very, very cognitive, and at some point, you don't need you transition from that deliberative state to an automatic state. And what is interesting is that perhaps those cognitive resources that have been freed up could be employed to derive more, you know, uh, contextualized responses uh, later on. So Serena Williams, when playing tennis under windy conditions, while she has mastered the sport, could use those cognitive resources to tune her motor responses to the conditions that exist. So a lot of it does seem to be this transition uh, from cognitive to automatic or reflex level. Yeah.
Okay, just a follow-up question. So, can repeated imitation lead to acquisition of that skill, just like driving?
Uh, Again, like I said, practice may not be enough. Practice is a huge component of this, right? So practice does lead to skill acquisition. I'm not denying that at all. But to be really highly skilled, uh, you need much more than practice. Imitation, we know that, for instance, cricket players will follow through with their actions. They will practice, swinging the bat a certain way in the air. I think all of that helps, uh, but getting to a certain level of skill is much more than all of that put together.
Okay, sir. So the next question is there a trade-off between motor movements and cognition? For example, if we do have a heavy motor activity at a point in time and given a cognitive task at the same time, will the cognitive task or motor movement will have poorer performance because of the load?
Yes, initially yes, right? Because again, if your motor task requires cognition, and then you're engaged in a different cognitive task, your resources are used up elsewhere, and therefore your motor performance will suffer. But a large chunk, I keep going back to skill, a large chunk of skill learning is developing that resistance to that kind of distraction, right? So your motor tasks become so automatic that your secondary cognitive task does not influence it anymore. But initially, yes.
I hope that information helps the audience. So the next question is social animals like lions engage in rough play with other members of their herd without causing any physical harm. On the other hand, when they go hunting, they get brutal. In the former case, are cognitive function playing a role in modulating their motor behavior?
Absolutely. there's no doubt. I think there is a very strong sort of neural uh, system dedicated to inhibition. And I think we inhibit certain actions that could be causing harm. I'm sure the animals do that, uh, when they're playing versus when they're actually hunting. What is interesting about hunting also is, related to inhibition, is how does the animal know uh, when to attack its prey, right? So you look at these videos of cheetahs, uh, very, very sort of slowly creeping up, and that's a strong inhibition, right? I mean, there's this hungry cheetah that just wants to eat its prey, and yet it has to inhibit its motor response until it finds the right opportunity to go the the prey. And so you see this inhibition even creep up in the actual hunting scenario. Uh, but yeah, I mean, the action itself, that's why I keep saying that there's a very strong cognitive influence that contextualizes the response, even in animals.
Okay. I hope that answered the audience question. So the next question is by Rennie Johnson. Will a sprinter or someone trained for skilled lower limb movement have a higher motor representation for lower limbs and brain? And is there any morphological change in motor cortex due to amputation?
Yes. So the latter answer is yes. There are changes that occur in the brain due to amputation. That is well studied. Um, and in fact, these are not limited to motor cortex. There's a recent study that came out in PNAS, which shows that these changes are more widespread, and could spread to even the parietal cortex, for instance. I think these changes are everywhere. Uh, as far as these skill-based changes in cortical structure, uh, yes, I think again that these representations uh, of body parts do change with practice. In sprinters, it is possible that they have higher uh, areas dedicated to the limb muscles than normal. I mean, the legs are not taking over the hand area. I mean, that's clear. Okay, but there is some plasticity that potentially emerges as you use the lower limbs more from the upper.
Okay. So the next question is: we know that we can have false declarative memories. Is it possible to have false procedural memories?
I couldn't hear that question
Okay,
clearly.
okay. Sorry. We know that we can have false declarative memories. Is it possible to have false procedural memories?
Um, I would uh, first of all do away with this distinction between declarative and procedural. And part of my talk was that I think this distinction between what is explicit, cognitive, deliberate, declarative, and what is procedural is really false. uh, you know procedural systems are not really uh, devoid of deliberative processes. Okay, so as far as false procedural memories go, I'll still try to attempt to answer that question. uh, it's possible, and you could view habits, for instance, as that, where you have these memorized motor responses uh, occurring even when they are inappropriate, right? So that's what habits have typically been defined as, where you have movements that occur even when they are inappropriate for the task context. And in some sense, I would view that as a false motor memory that's been played out.
So the next question: in rehabilitation, how significant is neuromodulatory intervention? Multiple studies have shown promising results. What is your take on it?
Uh, I don't think we have an answer yet. Uh, if multiple studies have shown promising results, multiple studies have also said that it doesn't work. Uh, and we don't know at the moment what works. What might work is what we are somewhat certain will work is very high intensity uh, exercise like training protocols uh, for stroke patients. Okay, I think that should be the baseline. Anything that you add on top of it, uh, if it works, will be bonus, right? So I mean, there was a time when um, robotics was the rage. We don't know if that works. Multiple studies say that it doesn't work beyond what your traditional therapy will give you. Okay, so traditional therapy, high intensity, high dosage therapy is what is needed as sort of a baseline, and then on top of that, we don't know if these other things work at the moment.
Okay, so hopefully one of the listeners will work on it. So the next question is, what is generalization of learned activity? Is interlimb transfer of learned activity possible?
Oh
Uh,
yes, uh, yes, and we've done a lot of work in our lab on that. Interlimb generalization is certainly possible. Uh, Again, there seems to be a weird effect there that we see in our lab and others see uh, also, where there is a laterality effect to how information transfers. Uh, what we find is, at least in the kind of perturbations that I showed you earlier, uh, the transfer seems to occur from the left limb to the right, but not the right limb to the left. Uh, and we have some explanation for it. Let me not get into it here. But the answer is that yes, learned information can generalize to different limbs in skill tasks. Okay, in tasks that require improvement in performance under unperturbed conditions, where so you could think of learning sports as an example, right, where you're not really applying a perturbation of any kind but just trying to get better than your baseline performance. In those kinds of tasks, there is symmetric generalization uh, of of the learned information, but generalization does occur. It occurs within a limb and across limbs. So within a limb, for instance, if I've trained only in one direction or one movement, and I now test on some other uh, directions that I've not trained in, there does seem to be generalization of that also. It is narrow though, okay, and it doesn't last very long. This is also a problem for rehabilitation. Uh, for instance, people have tried to rehabilitate instruments, right? So you would have a split belt treadmill where where the affected limb, the affected leg, is moved at a rate that is different from the unaffected limb. People learn that, and as a result, the movement becomes symmetric. But then when you check on overground walking, when people are removed from the treadmill and just asked to walk on the ground, it does not transfer very well. So while transfer occurs, it is limited, it is short lasting, it's not very long lasting, and this continues to be a challenge for rehab.
so you said from left to right is possible. So if, for example, sports example again, LeBron James injured his right limb, how soon can his left limb learn basketball with that same accuracy?
I don't know. I don't know. And I really don't know. I mean, why go to LeBron James? We could talk about writing. If I fracture my right hand and I try to write with the left, um, I don't think we can write very well. Maybe with a lot of extensive practice, we can get better. But writing may be so overlearned that there's a very strong lateralization component to it. Uh, that it's in right-handers at least, that it's so that it's become purely left hemisphere dependent, and so now to ask the right hemisphere to take over writing is difficult, I think.
Okay, so So, sir, the last question. Are there any methodologies for studying movement planning?
Are there any? Sorry.
Methodologies for studying movement planning.
Yes, there's a lot of methodologies for studying movement planning. The most common paradigm seems to be what is called a delayed response paradigm, where the stimulus is shown, but the motor response is expected after a certain delay. Uh, and you can probe the planning processes during that delay period. And you could vary that delay. You could do different things in the environment during that delay. For instance, uh, as soon, very close to the go signal, you could change the target location, look at whether that how that pre-planned movement gets executed. Or you could change the target location, well before your go signal. And you could study planning that way. A lot of people do this, playing around with this delay period between when a stimulus is shown and when a motor response is expected.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much for this insightful session. I hope it helped all the listeners in the long run. Anyone whose question wasn't answered, please connect with Sir on his Twitter handle. On the behalf
Or
of
email me.
email, so should I give the email ID on the chat?
Sure, yeah, you can share it,
Okay,
participant later.
okay, sir. So, on the behalf of the Brain Awareness Week and the students, I thank Dr. Mutha. I also thank the listeners for asking such insightful questions. I hope this seminar helped answer some of their questions about how every moment is made. In short, how motor movements are made. So
Thank you
thank
very
you so
much.
much, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I request everyone to please check out the Brain Awareness Week website. And the next session is from 5 to 6 p.m. with Shantala Hedge. The topic of the next session is The Beat Goes On, Rhythm and the Human Brain. I thank you, sir. Thank you so much.